Hey everyone. Okay, week 2 of this new all online History 1300. I hope that you all are doing well, and I hope that the first week went okay. It looks like things are going pretty well on my end, so if there are ever any problems or you're facing any challenges, feel free to contact me, to email me, or to schedule an appointment for a video conference. I'm always available and ready to help out, so let me know and stay in touch, okay? In this video, what I want to do is I want to accomplish a few things. First, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the week, to tell you what you need to do this week, what kinds of assignments are around this week. And then second, I want to give a little bit of a review of the stuff that you learned last week about the causes of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and also do a little bit of a sort of overview of some of the laws that came about that kind of formalized the Chinese Exclusion Act and sort of brought out its implications in the way that it was enforced during the period of Chinese exclusion. Then after that, I want to talk a little bit about the paper assignment, the second paper assignment that you have, and that will be due not at the end of this week, but the end of next week. So I want to go over that for a little bit in this video as well, and that will pretty much be it. So that's the task for this video. Hopefully I'll make it as quick as possible. Okay, overview for this week. So this week you have a few things to do. First, you have to watch 2 different videos. This video that you're watching right now, and then I've also uploaded a second video in which I go into some of the big themes that I want you to be focusing on in the readings for this week. Some of the things about Chinese immigrants' experiences during this period that you need to kind of keep in mind and pay attention to as you go through the readings. You also have to do the readings for this week, which all of them are primary sources, and they all come from Judy Jung's book. You'll be reading a series of documents all relating to the enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the experiences of Chinese immigrants during this period. And then you have 2 assignments to do. First, a quiz that tests your knowledge and comprehension of the readings, the assigned readings, and then an online assignment that helps you put together the material from the videos, the material from the readings, all together to kind of understand and have a sense of what was going on with Chinese immigrants during this period. And I really encourage you to work hard on this one because this one's going to set you up really well for the paper. So make sure to do a really good job on this one. And of course, the last thing I kind of want to give you a heads up on is be aware of the paper assignment. Go on to Canvas and look at the assignment instructions now, soon as you can, because if you have that assignment in the back of your mind, you can start to sort of take notes as you read through these documents and organize your thoughts on these documents and how they'll help you out when you write your paper going forward. So take a look at that assignment now. So that you know what's coming and so that you can sort of be informed on how to read and what to pay attention to in the readings. Okay, good. Let's turn now to a little bit of review and a little bit of overview. The first thing I want to do is review some of the stuff that you read about and wrote about last week, about the causes of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I think in looking through students' writings and what you all said, I think some of the things that came up, some of the most important things to remember about the causes of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So where the Chinese Exclusion Act comes from are, first, that it comes out of nativism. So this connects to a topic that we talked about weeks ago, about the kind of rise of nativism and the way that nativism changed in the United States over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Nativism is really the main context to understand the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it sort of manifested itself in 2 basic ways. Nativists had kind of 2 primary concerns about immigration. First was an economic concern. Many nativist groups were concerned that immigrants would come to the United States and challenge for jobs, right? Challenge American citizens for jobs. This became particularly a really important and intense part of the argument in the 1870s when the U.S. went through a depression, the Long Depression, starting in about 1877. And so when the economic situation of the United States kind of plummeted, all of a sudden jobs became really highly political and highly important, and people started arguing against immigration on the basis of sort of job competition, right? You can see this in actually document 12, one of the images that you looked at from last week, in which an image of a Chinese immigrant sort of doing all these different occupations has a sort of split screen, and on the other side you see essentially this kind of question of, well, what will our boys do? Our being sort of English-speaking white Americans, right? What jobs will they do? That's kind of the concern, this economic nativism, right? The second part of nativism is obviously racial, right? There was a deep racist sentiment that animated nativist arguments throughout this period. And with Chinese immigrants in particular, you see this come out in lots of different ways, right? Lots of racist assumptions about Chinese immigrants and their impact on American society, right? Chinese immigrants get associated with disease and with lack of health and hygiene, right? They get sort of lambasted for not assimilating to American culture. There are all sorts of assumptions that are made about Chinese immigrants as a whole and deemed essentially incompatible with American white sort of racial culture. And you saw this in a lot of the images that you looked at from last week. Document 9 is one really good example of this. It's an advertisement, but it's an advertisement that plays upon these racist sort of ideas about Chinese immigrants, right? So this nativism is a really important part of the context. It kind of undergirds a lot of why the Chinese Exclusion Act happened. And it undergirds a lot of the stuff that happens around the Chinese American community too. The violence between Chinese immigrants and white English-speaking Americans, right? The lynchings that happen in places like Los Angeles and elsewhere. This is all kind of ramifications and reflections of this deep nativist kind of sentiments at this time. Another important element that came out and that's really significant for bringing about the Chinese Exclusion Act is the kind of political consensus that emerged around Chinese exclusion in the 1880s, right? Judy Young does a really good job of overviewing this, that Republicans and Democrats, right, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, both come to see Chinese exclusion as a winning political issue. And so both of them add that to their party platforms. And so when this political consensus emerges, you don't see any real political resistance to Chinese exclusion, starting in the 1880s and really going all the way through the first half of the 20th century as well. Very few politicians objected to Chinese exclusion. So that sort of set up the circumstance as well. And document 14, another good image that sort of reflects this, right? The fact that Republicans and Democrats both were pressuring the Chinese American community. Okay, the second part of the overview that I want to go over is this overview of laws. So in a previous video, I talked a little bit about the laws that were important setting up the context of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. I want to talk to you a little bit about laws that followed the Chinese Exclusion Act that helped sort of implement it and teased out some of the specifics of how Chinese exclusion would be enforced. So of course, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, you have that in 1882, right? And it sets forth a few very specific things. You read this act yourself, so you know probably the details of it. But basically, it prohibits Chinese laborers from entering the country. But it makes exempt certain people, right? Certain types of people. We'll go into a little more detail about that in the next video. So I'm going to leave that for the next video. It's technically temporary when it first comes up, right? 10 years is supposed to suspend immigration for 10 years, but it's made permanent in 1904, right? So it really becomes a permanent law in 1904 without any endpoint in sight at that time. A few laws that come after this that help sort of enforce this in a variety of ways. So in 1885, there are a series of laws that come out that restrict Chinese immigrants even coming from places other than China, right? So Chinese immigrants coming from places like Canada or Mexico, right, fall under the same regulations as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Also in 1885, you get laws that talk about how essentially the U.S. consul has to approve any exemptions, right? So the people who applied for exemption status to the law had to go through the U.S. consul in China, right, before coming to the United States. In 1888, right, there's more of a stipulation of the exact type of people that are allowed in, right? So it helps kind of figure out who's a laborer and who's not a laborer, right? That's the Scott Act of 1888. And then the Geary Act of 1892 actually makes it even harder for some of the exempt people, specifically merchants, from coming into the country by mandating that merchants have to have 2 white witnesses that can attest to their status as merchants in the United States. So even more so, right? You see it get harder and harder and harder for Chinese immigrants to come into the country over the course of the 1880s and 1890s. Okay, so I wanted to put that before you so that you have a context for what this law is like and what the specifics of it are, so that you know what the experiences can be and would be for Chinese immigrants at this time. Next, I want to turn to the paper assignment. So the second paper that you're going to write is very different from the first paper because essentially what it's going to be about is you're going to write a sort of piece of historical fiction in which you're going to present a first-person narrative, a fictional sort of story of an imagined Chinese immigrant coming to this country, to the United States, during the period of Chinese exclusion, and specifically during the period of the Angel Island facility, which is 1910 to 1940. So you have to write your story about a Chinese immigrant coming to the country in that time, okay? The story has to be historically consistent, which means that it has to fit with the facts of the history as we know them. Okay, so you can't write a story that doesn't make sense within the context, right? So if you have just a person who's a Chinese laborer who shows up at Angel Island and says, "I'm a laborer," and then the people say, "Yes, welcome in," that's wrong, right? That never would have happened. So you have to write a story that is historically consistent. You also have to base it on the primary sources that you're reading in Judy Young's book. Don't consult outside sources for this paper. You don't need them. Use the sources for this class, primarily the sources that you're reading in Judy Young's book. You have to base your story on those sources so that everything that you write in your story is kind of coming from things that that actual Chinese immigrants and the people around them sort of talked about, right? So you have to analyze these primary sources first to kind of understand how you're going to construct your narrative, right? And then, so that's the first section of the paper, is this story, right? You're going to write a story, a fictional story about a Chinese immigrant, but make it as historically consistent as possible. The second section is you're going to kind of flip the switch and become a historian again, and you're going to write essentially an analysis of your story to show how you based the story on primary sources, right? So in the story itself, you're not going to quote any primary sources or anything like that. You're just going to plop in citations to sort of show the various documents that you're using to create that story. In the second section, you're going to explain how you did that work, right? What was it? What passage was it from the source that led you to make that narrative decision, right? What kinds of things did you see? How did you analyze the source to lead you to write the story in the way that you did? That's what you're going to do in that second section. And then you're going to end it with a paragraph at the end in which you do a little bit of comparison, just a one-paragraph comparison of the story you wrote to the experiences of other immigrants, either other Chinese immigrants coming at this time, or other immigrants coming at this time that were not Chinese, right? So think back to some of the weeks prior and the stories that we've learned about Italian immigrants or German immigrants or immigrants from Eastern Europe or something like that, right? To do a quick comparison just to show that you understand that the story you wrote is only one story, right? One type of story, and that there are actually various types of immigration experiences from people coming during this period. So that's the assignment. The assignment instructions are on Canvas. I really encourage you to go and read them as carefully as you can, as soon as you can, so that you know exactly what to expect. And if you have questions, just email me. Let me know, and I will answer any question that you have if you're confused or anything like that. Okay, one last thing that I just want to leave you with is that if in your paper you want to give your person, your character, a name, I'm going to just paste a sort of screenshot from a census website that I found that has actually names of specific Chinese immigrants coming in the early 20th century. And if you just want to use one of those names as a placeholder, that's totally fine. That can help you out with your story if you want to sort of use it in that way. So that's it for this video. Again, if you have any other questions or concerns, let me know. I can help out. Otherwise, watch the next video and do the readings and get to the quiz and the online assignment. All right, see you later.